Hello and welcome to our International Business TED Talk on Brazil, the fifth most populous country in the world and a member of the BRICS emerging economies community. We will have four guest speakers covering topics of globalisation, development, culture and competitive advantage. I hope you enjoy.
Globalisation is a cultural phenomenon which highlights widespread economic interdependence, best described by the ease in which large multinational companies are able to trade on an international platform, as governments have steadily decreased tariffs. Brazil is the largest country in South America and has a population of over 208 million people, according to the 2018 census. Brazil has unquestionably benefited from globalisation as their gross domestic product has increased tenfold from 1980 to 2018, recording $1,868 billion for 2018. In 2017, Brazil was the 22nd largest exporting country in the world, with their primary exports being soybeans, iron, wine, raw sugar and cars. They trade predominantly with China, the USA and Argentina, as they have a symbiotic trade agreement with those nations due to lower tariffs on their exports. Due to a low minimum wage of $265 per month, Brazil is viewed as a nation to outsource to, as this subsequently has translated to an inflow of finance to the Brazilian economy, reaffirming the nation's gains from globalisation.
How has Brazil benefited from globalisation?
Brazil has had multiple benefits from globalisation. As an emerging economy, Brazil has embraced globalisation with a reduction in protectionist policies as well as undertaking a microeconomic reform. Economic growth refers to the increase in productive capacity of an economy, and they can be assessed across a variety of measures, mainly gross domestic product and purchasing power parity. Gross domestic product is an assessment of a nation's goods and services and estimates their market value. Purchasing power parity is a comparison between a nation's economic productivity and their standard of living. Since embracing globalisation, Brazil has seen a positive uptick in both of these areas, which is a reflection of the nation's reform economic policies being successful. As estimated by the World Trade Organization, the Brazilian government cut tariffs from an average rate of 32.2% in 1980 to 10.47% in 2012, as they attempt to become more competitive within the international marketplace. Globalisation has led to increased investments within Brazil from both other governments and private investors, which has led to the continued expansion of the Brazilian economy. As organisations have continued to outsource to Brazil, the unemployment rate has steadily declined from 12.3% in 2008 to 4.7% in 2012. This uptick in employment has directly correlated to an improved living quality of the middle class within Brazil, as people are finding themselves earning a steady wage, which increases the likelihood that they are able to receive a loan. If one is eligible for a loan, the individual is able to expand their capital and use that finance to purchase a house or other items in which they deem essential for living. In order to further progress the economic development, the labour force must be challenged and upskilled with long-term economic growth stemming from their willingness to embrace education. Brazil has been an unquestioned winner from globalisation. The government's ability to accurately assess the international trend of globalisation and thereafter undertake economic reform has been a crucial factor in Brazil's success. Brazil's political restructuring has shifted a nation's outlook, as they have created a positive trade balance of $78.3 billion in 2017, compared to a negative trade balance of $4.26 billion in 1995, which reaffirms the successes of their new policies. Trade liberalisation has directly correlated to an increased investment in Brazil, as the shift from a dictatorship to a democracy in 1985 created an environment which was more appealing to those looking to outsource to Brazil. Despite many positive benefits arising from globalisation in Brazil, this has come at a direct cost to the environment. As more and more governments and private investors invest within Brazil, this results in the natural flora and fauna being impacted. As factories emerge and production commences, there is increased waste which needs to be disposed of, as well as pollution which is negatively impacting the environment. Brazil is home to the largest rainforest in the world, and pollution may impede the longevity of this natural wonder. If the forest is negatively affected, it has the potential to deter tourists, which will ultimately impact the nation's economy for the long run.
I want to thank Matt for his excellent performance on giving a talk about globalisation and how it affected Brazil. So what I'm going to talk about is the economic and human development of Brazil, and then which is more important for an Australian firm. So first of all, let's define economic development. It's the process by which the well-being and quality of life of a nation is improved. And the most common measure is GDP, which has already been defined by Matt. So, GDP growth in Brazil has been strong over the last 30 years, showing growth of up to 7% in the last 30 years. Despite recent poor economic performance, they've pulled out of a 2006 recession and have been showing steady growth. The forecasts for the future are based around 2.2% of up to 2024. So the future of the economic performance and development of Brazil, it looks bright on paper. However, the future economic development of Brazil depends on the success of the economic reforms come into play. So Brazil's future progress is constrained by the high taxes, the tendency towards protectionism, the weak infrastructure and corruption and crime that is rife through a lot of the Brazilian economy. Hence, Paulo Guedes, Brazil's finance minister, is pushing for reforms including a privatisation drive, an overhaul of Brazil's Byzantine tax system and a pensions reform, which is seen as shoring up public finances. So, Brazil has amazing potential to become a developed economy within the next 30 years due to its status as a BRICS economy, its abundant natural resources and its emerging middle class. And it looks like companies should invest now to capitalise on the future markets. However, just using GDP, it means it's an increasingly poor indicator of economic well-being, as there's loads of disadvantages to it. For example, it doesn't take into account inequality and demographics. It doesn't measure the size and significance of the shadow economy, the environment, or its resources. For example, there's the natural disaster paradox, which rebuilding infrastructure increases GDP on paper, but actually the well-being and the resource of a nation will be reduced from a natural disaster. For example, the current Amazonian forest fires. Due to these disadvantages of using GDP as an indicator for economic well-being, economists are increasingly looking towards human development indicators, which focus on the capabilities, opportunities and freedoms a population experiences. The main one is HDI, which is a composite indicator which includes education, life expectancy at birth, and GNI, just for standard of living, and was creating a reaction to the drawbacks of GDP. One of the advantages of HDI is that it's simple, so it provides a good reference point between countries. For example, you can compare Brazil and India, where Brazil ranks 79th on HDI, whereas India ranks 130th. But one problem is that it doesn't include inequality, and if you adjust HDI for inequality, the level that Brazil sits on falls dramatically, and there's a 23.9% decline in the HDI figure once adjusted for inequality. Also, HDI still makes no account for resources or the environment, and is still a rough proxy. However, in spite of the inequality experienced in Brazil, its Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, has fallen by 9% between 2011 and 2009. And this is as a result of the poverty reduction programme the Brazilian government has undertaken. However, it is worth noting that looking at economic development versus human development may not be very useful, as the two topics are very much interlinked. So which is more important for an Australian firm? Economic or human development indicators? Well, it highly depends on the type of firm and the industry and the nature of entry of the Australian firm looking to invest in Brazil. Development indicators can give a superficial view of the conditions of the markets you're expanding into. For example, you compare the HDI of Brazil to another BRICS country, and also it depends on the industry. So if you're an Australian manufacturing firm looking to invest in Brazil, HDI might be more important than GDP. This is because it gives a general view of the workforce's health and education levels as well as income. Low literacy rates and low labour costs could mean that setting up an assembly plant in Brazil could be beneficial compared to a more sophisticated and highly skilled manufacturing plant. However, HDI or GDP only gives a very basic view, and Australian firms must look deeper into the specific market conditions of what you're looking to expand to. And economic and human development indicators can only give a broad view of the economy.
Cultural distance is a function of differences in values and communication styles that are rooted in culture. Distance is created when individuals or groups perceive that their values and communication styles differ from others. Across international management, there are many ways we define culture. In this section of the TED Talk, I'm first going to use the most simple to briefly explain the cultures of both Brazil and Australia, that is, the elements of culture. Firstly, religion. Religion shapes ethical systems, morals, principles, and the values of right and wrong. Australia's main religion is Christianity, with a large percentile being Catholic and Anglican. Believe it or not, the most prevalent religion in Brazil is also Catholicism. Therefore, there is little cultural distance in this area. Political philosophy. This area of culture details the laws and rights of a given country. Australia operates under a representative democracy, meaning that everyone over the age of 18 has the right to say and vote lawmakers into Parliament. While Brazil functions under a bit of a different system, the presidential system, they do operate as a democracy, meaning that people still do have a say in their laws in their country. Again, there is little distance in this area. Economic philosophy. Australia is a mixed market economy, which means that the production are shared between the public and private sectors. Brazil is also a mixed economy, hence there is also little distance here. Education. Education in Australia consists of kindergarten, primary school, high school and tertiary education. Everybody is forced to go to school until mid to late high school. Education in Brazil is only compulsory between 7 and 14 years old. Other education is optional. This is a first dimension that shows us a fair bit of cultural distance. With respect to language, English is the main language in Australia. Portuguese is the main language in Brazil. With social structure, while Australia does contain social classes such as the upper class, middle class and lower class, due to Australia's central system, the gap between classes is very minimal. Majority of Australia is also made up of the middle class for this reason. As opposed to this, the social system in Brazil is much more rigid, with much wider gaps between classes. The rich and the poor hardly interact, and unfortunately race alone can play some part in this. Going beyond the simplicity of the elements of culture, we must consider Hofstede's cultural dimensions. The first is power distance. This measure represents the extent to which the less powerful members of society accept and expect power to be distributed unequally. Australia measures in at 36, while Brazil measures in at 69. Australia has quite a low reading here, representing that Australians are not willing to accept unequal distribution of power. This may relate to the fact that it is a part of Australia's culture, particularly those of Catholic morals, to look after the less fortunate. Brazil, on the other hand, has quite a high reading here, suggesting that they are more able to accept unequal distribution of power within their community. This may have something to do with how far apart their social classes have been over so many years, or their lack of a well-rounded education. Uncertainty avoidance. This measures the degree to which members of a society feel uncomfortable with uncertainty. Australia measures at 51, while Brazil measures at 76. This shows Australians are much more comfortable leaning back on our government and systems in place in times where their jobs, for example, may not be certain. Brazilians are obviously much more uncomfortable should their jobs come into question. This could be because of the difference in classes and the knowledge that should their job situation fall through, they will be dropped on the social hierarchy of the nation. Individualism and collectivism is the next point. This depicts the degree to which a culture emphasises individual goals over collective goals. Australia measures at 90, while Brazil measures at only 38. Although our classes are not too far apart in Australia, we are brought up to work for our livings, to work for the cars we want, the houses we want, and the holidays we want, and to provide for our own families. In comparison to this, Brazil is obviously much more country-orientated in their work efforts. They aim to better their country, not predominantly just their own. Masculinity and femininity is the next point. Masculinity refers to a preference in society for achievement, heroism, assertiveness, and material reward for success. Whereas femininity refers to a preference for cooperation, modesty, caring for the weak, and quality of life. Australia measures it at 61, while Brazil measures at 49. Australia is slightly more masculine, meaning that they have a preference for achievement, assertiveness, and material reward for success, whereas Brazil is much more neutral, measuring at exactly halfway between the two. Long-term and short-term orientation is the next point. This measures time-honoured traditions and norms while viewing societal change with suspicion, or preference to take an approach that encourages thrift and efforts in education to prepare for the future. Australia takes on an approach of investing in education to thrive for a better future. As quite a new country in the scheme of things, Australia does not hold plenty of old traditions. On the other hand, Brazil is quite an intermediate country in this respect. The next point is indulgence and restraint. Put simply, this measures how much fun countries have, as opposed to how much they may restrain their expenditure. Both Brazil and Australia prefer to indulge over restrain. Another source which we can use to assess the cultural distance between Australia and Brazil is Ronan and Shenkar's cultural clusters. When we examine this, it can be found that Australia is classed as an Anglo country. One brief description of these countries I found was driven and results orientated. On the other hand, Brazil is an independent country. This might suggest that they are quite different from the characteristics of the other clusters. With globalisation, I believe Australia and Brazil are becoming more divergent, as in addition to their different languages, levels of education and many more aspects discussed above, the clusters of countries suggest that while Australia is now more than ever becoming more integrated with other countries like the US and Canada, Brazil is still holding its own on the global scale.
Into the theory of comparative advantage. David Ricardo was a British political economist who was one of the most renowned and influential classical economists of his time, alongside the likes of Adam Smith. Ricardo developed an economic theory known as comparative advantage, whereby a country ought to specialise in goods and services which they develop more efficiently and import those that they develop less efficiently from other countries, even if they were able to make these goods more efficiently than the country they would import from. The ideology was different to Adam Smith's theory of absolute advantage, whereby a country should specialise in a good if they are more efficient in making it than other countries they would import it from. The ideology came about from this idea that whichever country is able to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost is said to have a comparative advantage. Ricardo believed that the levels of opportunity cost associated with producing goods and services was predominantly a result of the levels of productivity in making that good or services. Ricardo's comparative advantage theory was not based on cost of production in relation to money terms, but instead was based on real costs such as labour, time and other resources.
Given the theories on comparative advantage, how do they relate to Brazil's situation?
Brazil thrives in respect of basic factor endowments, with resource exploitation being responsible in part for driving Brazil's economy. Brazil exports 45% of the world's soybean exportation, 22% of the world's iron ore exportation, alongside large amounts of crude oil exportation, having a combined $63.4 billion and 28% of all exports. From what was once a country which was a net agricultural importer in the 1960s and 70s, is now to be claimed as the third largest net agricultural exporter after the US and the EU. Brazil is ranked on a global scale number 1 in the exportation of beef, poultry, sugar, ethanol, orange juice and coffee. As previously introduced, in the eyes of David Ricardo, a country ought to specialise in what they have a comparative advantage in, and hence excel in terms of productivity and efficiency most. Brazil's rich source of natural endowments provides Brazil with a foundation as to what they should specialise in. In 2013, whilst the agriculture industry certainly showed signs of high productivity, the extraction sector proved to be 5.5 times higher in terms of productivity, and the utility sector trumping this and being 6.4 times higher as of 2013. Since then, the agriculture sector grew by up to 10.74% in 2017, generating record wealth for Brazil. Whilst acreage increased by 4% for the 2016-17 harvest, productivity across the field was up by 22.8%, showing encouraging evidence of Brazil's ability to be productively efficient, hence making Brazil the most productive agricultural industry in the entire world, even surpassing developed economies. Brazil is known for having low levels of advanced factor endowments, especially when it comes to labour productivity, and hence lack productive efficiency on a domestic scale as well as a global scale. It is stated that 2/3 of employees have difficulty recruiting appropriate staff. An example of this is the lack of labour productivity that can be seen in industries which are supposedly productive, such as the oil industry, whereby a company, Petrobras, employs 6 times the amount of employees to its competitors to make up for the lack of graduates. With Brazil's low level of advanced factor endowments and high levels of basic factor endowments, Brazil ought to specialise like they have been doing in industries such as agriculture, mining, utilities, and even if other countries are more productive in doing so, they should specialise in these industries. Australia shares a common similarity to Brazil in respect to the country's excessive supplies of basic factor endowments, especially in respect to natural resources once again. Australia is responsible for exporting 52% of the world's iron ore supply, alongside being the largest exporter of coal, exporting 39% of the world's coal supply. Whilst the mining sector and agriculture sector have been at the forefront of Australia's most productive sectors for many years, the rate at which productive growth in these sectors is increasing is definitely slowing down, and in some cases is experiencing negative growth. In the year 2000, sectoral labour productivity in mining reached close to 180 in relation to the index number of 100 in 1989. As of 2011 to 2012, the productivity growth in the mining sector fell so much that it was below the level it was at in 1989. However, has since regained small positive growth as of 2014, with multi-factor productivity growing by 0.9% in 2018 to 19. With Australia being a developed economy, advanced factor endowments separate levels of productivity in certain industries from others. The country has advanced levels of education and highly skilled labour, especially in the engineering sector. Mining relies on those highly skilled engineers alongside constant gains in technological progression in order to make productivity gains which overpower the losses from increased scarcity, diseconomies of scale, and reduced supply of finite resources. In recent years, manufacturing, finance and insurance services, and professional scientific and technical services have all been industries in which Australia has seen the highest rate of productivity growth in. In the eyes of David Ricardo, Australia should continue to specialise in mining, as this is where they have a comparative advantage and are most productive. Perhaps in the future, however, with the rate at which manufacturing and professional service industries are growing in terms of productivity, alongside the development of world-class education system providing highly skilled labour, net productivity may be greater in these industries than the mining industry, and hence Australia should focus on specialising in these industries. I hope you all enjoyed our presentations, including me, Alex, Matt and Hannah ourselves, and I'd like to thank you for coming to our TED Talk, and I hope to see you again.